Again, everyone, for joining us today. This is our 5th Lunch and Learn webinar in a 5-part series for the healthcare industry. And today's topic is titled Buying or Selling a Physician Practice, Avoiding Common Pitfalls. And I'm Kate Hickner. I'm a transactional healthcare attorney. I'm a partner at Brennan Mann & Diamond. And my practice focuses on mergers, acquisitions, and other business law matters in the healthcare space. But necessarily because of this industry, I provide regulatory and compliance guidance to my clients on a daily basis. And I'm really excited to talk about this topic because I've worked on so many of these transactions over the years, and I find that whether they're small transactions or very large transactions, there are certain commonalities. And so hopefully we'll touch on these today. And I'm very honored to be here with Jerry Kalsheimer from Medic Management Group. And Jerry, I'll let you say a few words to introduce yourself, if that's okay.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me, Kate. So I am with MMG Healthcare Solutions, Medic Management Group. We're a back office service provider to physician practices all over the country, as well as an advisor and a consultant to independent practices, private equity, health systems, and any and all that are in healthcare, and do spend a fair amount of time in and around the transaction world, predominantly in supporting existing clients as they look at strategic alternatives for their practices. And glad to share a bit about our observations and experience in that area as we go through the next 30, 45 minutes or so. Okay,
great. Thanks, Jerry. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to cover a few slides and then hand it off to Jerry. And our goal is really to have you walk away from this discussion with just a few pieces of practical guidance that you can use in your own practice or your organizations. And then we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. Please feel free to reach out to us if you don't want to discuss in the group with any questions that you have afterwards. I want to start off the discussion by just offering a bit of context. Healthcare, as we all know, is big business. But when we think about it, in 2007, the healthcare industry accounted for 16.4% of the GDP. By this year, it should account for 19.9%. So there's tremendous growth in this area. There are a lot of transactions and a lot of business being done. And I know that Jerry and I see that definitely on a daily basis. The current environment, there's been this wave of integration going on within the industry for at least 12 years or so. And we know that physicians are increasingly choosing to be employed, whether by a system or a larger group, as opposed to owning their own practices. And the percentage of US physicians employed by hospitals or health systems or other corporate entities, sometimes private equity, grew from 62.2% in 2019 to 73.9% in January 2022. So think about that, 62.2 to 73.9, tremendous movement there and shift towards an employed model. But not all physicians are on board. And I just put a quote up here from a recent article that I had read in Becker's. There's a lawsuit, physicians claiming that Hartford Healthcare has told some physicians that if they didn't integrate, that Hartford Healthcare would crush them. And when I read that quote, it just made me chuckle a little bit. I think that we all know a hospital VP or a business development person that we can hear saying that. So physicians are under quite a bit of pressure. We also often read that compensation has remained relatively flat for physicians, but on a per physician basis, physician compensation has reached the highest level in 2 years, driven primarily by increased productivity. Physicians are busy, and as we all know, there's an incredible amount of burnout right now. So acknowledging that there's a tension out there and that not all physicians are on the same page in terms of which practice model is most desirable, I just want to touch upon the reasons for consolidation within the industry. So we have payment for value, quality, and efficiency instead of just a fee for service, model, and that's changing over time. It's also difficult for small practices to keep up with the latest technology and equipment. Sometimes equipment is cost prohibitive, and many physicians just don't have the technical expertise that they need to keep up with the times. There's also a cultural shift that commentators have focused on. Younger physicians seem to perceive working for a larger practice or even owned by private equity or a health system as affording like greater work-life balance.
So crowded.
I'm just gonna see if I can take a second and mute some of the participants here. Okay, that's great. Sorry about that, guys. So there are economies of scale, obviously, and there's a desire to increase leverage with payers. And I just want to say that, you know, all these different reasons can drive, you know, different models as being the most desirable. There are lots of different ways to align, and buying or selling a physician practice is one of the most highly integrated ways to address these issues, but it's not the only one. So we won't go into this too much today, but there are also leasing arrangements, management services arrangements, clinically integrated networks, ACOs, professional services agreements, and the list goes on and on. And Jerry, I know you're working with physician practices on a daily basis. I'm just curious, in terms of industry challenges, what they're sharing with you, the challenges that they're facing. Do you have any comments on that?
Sure, Kate. You know, and include some of the reasons you've listed here for consolidation. I'd say one that you know, perhaps isn't on your list. You know, this is an increasingly tight labor market, and that you know, that covers you know, that covers broad bandwidth. You know, from clinical support to administrative and back office support. It's the general shift in demographics, which creates challenges. And I'm speaking specifically to provider level succession in both practice execution and ownership. You know, reimbursement and the transition to value-based models. Also, the general nature of consumerism and the patient as a consumer with choices. Bottom line is, you know, I think a big challenge in healthcare today at the provider practice group level, regardless of size of practice, is just generally keeping up with change.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Oh, sorry about that. Went through these slides a little bit quickly. Yeah, no, I hear that as well. One of the more challenging situations that some of my clients face are, you know, if they're in the aesthetics or plastic surgery space, how to deal with succession planning issues. And also smaller practices have some challenges with that as well. So yeah, no, I agree with your comments. So on this slide, I set forth a checklist of legal considerations. I'm a lawyer, so I really feel like I need to talk about the actual law a little bit, but I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. But as a healthcare attorney, one of our most important jobs is to issue spot and foresee risks and hurdles so that they can be addressed in a way that really protects our client. And we always try to be proactive instead of reactive. And so in every deal, whether I'm representing the buyer or the seller, we need to think through numerous state and federal healthcare laws and determine what's governing, which laws are implicated, and then how we're going to ensure that the transaction is defensible. Ultimately, these laws, even though they're all different, they're typically designed to protect the physician-patient relationship and to deter overutilization. And I think it's important to keep those concepts in the back of our mind as we kind of move forward with the transaction. They're really designed to ensure that the physicians are acting in the best interests of their patients and not their wallets. A common theme underlying many of these laws is fair market value, and the government is heavily focused on the big three, which refers to fair market value, commercial reasonableness, and volume and value. And it's the government's term for those kind of three topics. The government takes the position that if someone's paying for more than fair market value for a physician practice, they're really paying for the business or the referrals. And that's illegal under the anti-kickback statute. So so under the anti-kickback statute and the federal Stark law, when it's implicated, state fee splitting laws, And then tax exempt laws, when there's a tax exempt entity as a party, we always need to think about fair market value. It's imperative. And third-party valuations are not per se required, but obtaining a third-party valuation is the best approach from a legal perspective. And clients need to make their decision based upon their own risk tolerance, whether they're going to move forward and do that. But I always recommend it, as do almost all other healthcare attorneys. Valuations really help to protect both parties in the case the relationship is ever scrutinized. And, that's important because we find ourselves in a very robust regulatory enforcement environment. The Department of Justice announced last week that actually a few months ago, that the United States recovered $5.6 billion from False Claims Act cases in 2021. And of that, $5 billion was related to healthcare fraud. So the government knows that going after the healthcare industry is a great way to generate revenue and a tremendous amount of funds. So it's important that we ensure that each transaction is defensible. Now that I've appropriately scared everyone with a summary of some healthcare regulation principles, I just want to share 5 practical tips for physicians who are buying or selling a physician practice. So the first bullet point up here on the slide is clearly define, communicate, and remember what the underlying purpose of the transaction is. And in order for practice leaders to negotiate the deal and attorneys to structure the transaction in the best way possible, all need to remember what the ultimate business objective is. This really helps the discussions to stay on track and remembering what really matters instead of becoming focused on less significant issues. And in my experience, this is particularly important with smaller deals or transactions, even if they're very significant, when a seller is not used to working on transactions like this, maybe a little bit less sophisticated. They're not accustomed to deciding what is or isn't material. And we often spend a lot of time focusing on the materiality threshold and just to move the transaction along. And it's also important to make sure that remembering, the ultimate goal is important to making sure that negotiations don't become clouded by emotion or ego. And that often comes into play if, a group of physicians have spent their whole life building a practice and, they're exiting before retirement. It's very personal to them. The second bullet point, carefully select transaction participants. I would just say that negotiating a successful physician practice transaction involves a lot more than beautifully drafted legal documents. It's really, really important that the buyer and the seller trust one another and that they have compatible cultures and share similar values. And I think this is especially true when physicians on both sides of the deal will continue working together after the closing, which often is the case in my experience with physician practice purchases. So, most healthcare attorneys can share stories about transactions that unwound as quickly as they came together because the parties weren't able to get along. There's one transaction that I worked on about 10 years or so ago, but it was in New York, and it was a very, very significant transaction. And within a year, we had to unwind it because of lack of trust. So important to really think about who you're partnering with, because it's really a tremendous waste of resources and very emotionally draining when it doesn't work out. And along those lines, it's very important to conduct not only regulatory and financial diligence, but also reputational and cultural diligence. And I think this should be done early in the process. There's no doubt that we should do the financial and legal and regulatory diligence, look at the contracts, but it's also important to ask, especially if the seller is going to be working with a buyer post-closing, does the buyer have an active and robust compliance program? Review, patient charts and billing records, ask the right questions, invest the resources on the front end so that you don't in the back end. It's also really important for the parties to discuss their expectations regarding autonomy or managerial control, transparency, day-to-day operational issues. So for example, if the seller is used to a physician-led organization that offers a ton of autonomy to each physician, but the buyer expects physician conformity and a greater level of administrative oversight, the buyer and the seller might not be compatible. And we see that coming up from time to time. The third bullet point up here, identify a strong negotiating team. So it's very important that the negotiating team understand the underlying purpose and the business objectives, that they're nimble and responsive, and that they're on the same page as their governing bodies. I did see a transaction several years ago where the negotiating team worked very diligently on a transaction, but couldn't get it approved by the shareholders once they presented the transaction for the corporate approvals. And that was a really bad situation. Jerry, do you have any advice in your experience on how to select the best negotiating team and maybe the types of officers that should be involved, who should be in the loop during negotiations to preserve confidentiality, but also to make sure it's done efficiently? Do you have any insight on that?
My first reaction to that question, Kate, is important to put your team together early. When it comes to not just negotiation, but actually organization and planning for communications and activity that's going to need to take place during the course of a transaction. Being ahead of rather than reacting to challenge, I think is always important. So forming team early, and then where I've seen things go wrong in the past and or contrast that with things going right. I think as sellers, and again, this could be this could be millions of dollar transactions or hundreds of $1 million transactions. Sometimes we have a propensity to go straight to the people that we know and that we're comfortable with, and those individuals or those professional firms may or may not be the best fit for seeing a transaction through in a successful and efficient manner. So really asking some practical questions around what do I need from a legal perspective, from an accounting perspective, from a professional advisory perspective, and being purposeful, intentional about assembling not just a team and not just a team that I'm most comfortable with, but the right team to get a good outcome for me is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's good advice. Okay, my fourth tip, include legal advisors during the initial stages of discussions. It obviously sounds kind of self-serving for me to say that, but attorneys who are included at the outset are really in the best position to mitigate regulatory risk, legal risk, and ensure that the negotiations and the transaction itself are as efficient as possible. Most healthcare attorneys that work on transactions had a very, very busy year last year and are finding the same thing this year. And so, they, contrary to what some people think, most attorneys do work as efficiently as possible. And just because of their experience working on numerous deals, they can really help the business team out and help organize things and set a timeline and expectations and move things along. So, I would just say that healthcare attorneys, our job is really to get the deal done, of course, while protecting our clients as well. But most of us are pretty good at that.
Okay, can I interject something to
Sure.
that point? It's always interesting. You're going to be hard pressed to find a mid-sized to large law firm today that's not going to tell you they've got they've got great healthcare lawyers. Our experience has been many firms have great transaction lawyers and great healthcare lawyers. What you just described, and when we know that. There is somewhat of a unique dynamic to selling medical practices, some of which has to do with emotion. I think you mentioned it earlier. Sellers have concerns about patient care matters, about the epicenter of the transaction is much about fronting their personal compensation, or partner and provider compensation for. They have they've typically managed staff like family, regardless of the size of the group. So ensuring that you don't just have good healthcare lawyers and or transaction lawyers, but good healthcare transaction lawyers. They can make a world of difference in terms of looking for the right successful outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just a follow-up question to that. Can you, I know just because of my experience in different transactions, a little bit about what your firm does, but Jerry, can you share how your team comes into a transaction and works with the lawyers, and kind of how you see that relationship going in an ideal scenario?
Sure. Skate, we would, our scope of work could vary by transaction depending on the need of a client, but I would say our typical work in a transaction scenario is going to be to play facilitator of sorts, and at times interpreter, ensuring that accountant and lawyer are connected and other advisors are connected to the client. The client, as an operating clinical practice, is able to stay focused on mission and execution of the practice. While we support all professionals that are involved in their interaction with with a potential buyer. So that could range from organization, preparation, review of diligence information. It could include participation as a member of the negotiating team, or being a primary party as a part of a negotiating team. Helping to manage, I don't know, for lack of a better way to put it, emotions and psychology around a table as a participant that's had exposure, to relative amount of sophisticated exposure to each and every constituency profile, buyer, seller, advisor, et cetera. We act as an extension of the seller that hopefully serves in a pretty balanced and reasonable and calm manner to achieve outcomes that we help our clients define.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I've worked with people on your team on transactions, especially Tom Berkovic is one example, but there are definitely others as well. Renan Izakov is another one, but your group, speaks the language, and not all physicians are good businessmen. So I think having the support of your team is really important, and it's having that guidance there, and then also, a good attorney. Really, I think the clients are in good hands when that occurs. So my last piece of advice is that both buyers and sellers need to ensure that the written deal terms are clear and that they're comprehensive, and also that they provide flexibility. And it may sound like this would go without saying, but you'd be surprised how many transactions have side conversations or expectations that don't make it into the documents. Obviously, that's a more serious situation if those discussions implicate the regulations and maybe are not defensible. But even just simple deal terms, business terms, really important to communicate with the attorneys and make sure that those terms are in the documents. Obviously, a verbal promise made during negotiation is generally not legally enforceable. And so anything that's important should be in writing. And I know a few minutes ago I mentioned a transaction that I worked on that was very significant and then unwound within a year. Sometimes transactions are unsuccessful. And so in my opinion, it's advisable for the transaction documents to address the terms of an unwind, if that's a possibility. I have had a health system that I've worked with say, no way are we going to do that. We want these physicians locked in. We don't want to make it easy for them to leave. But especially from the seller's perspective, if there's a chance that this isn't going to be a good cultural fit, or that there's a lack of trust, building in those unwind provisions is really, really important. And let's see, I guess that we're at your slides now. Jerry, do you want to kind of go ahead?
Sure, I'll take it. I've got maybe 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes worth of comments and just a few slides here. Kate, again, thank you. Yeah, you may, Kate shared a bit from a legal perspective. I'll focus more here on business perspective and business dynamics. To the topic of avoiding pitfalls, it just struck me a good place to start might be why we've seen transactions stall or ultimately fail. Whether a $5 million, $50 million, $150 million transaction. The themes that we've experienced, stalls or negative evolutions or failures tend to come from one of three places. Either a seller is not prepared, either practically or psychologically, to execute. Secondly, a buyer is trying too hard. I'll use a technical term, stretching, or rationalizing. And somewhere in the middle of that triangle, tends to be communication challenges. So what do we mean when I reference seller preparedness? It's essentially sellers that are reactionary versus purposeful. Somebody's approached me, and I heard a number, and it was a huge number, and I'm excited about it. So we're going to start down a path, perhaps without having, as Kate suggested, attached myself to legitimate advisors, without my having stopped to think about what's important to me, whether that's a specific valuation, a structure on a transaction, what I expect my compensation to be, what my lifestyle will look like, what the post transaction dynamic needs to be for me to be feeling good about it. I haven't organized my diligence in advance, and I haven't aligned other people that are important to the transaction. Could be partners in a practice, could be other dependent constituencies that are in a chain of integration of clinical delivery, could be spouses for that matter. So important to define success and define a path to execute. When it comes to communication, I know this is all very basic, and we've got experienced deal people on the line here, but we can say it because we all would agree with it. Nobody likes surprises. Problems happen in transactions and in transaction timelines when there are surprises. So, the three primary areas, where we've tended to see surprise and misunderstanding might be in an internal alignment where, either by accident or on purpose, those involved, within the framework of seller infrastructure are not talking about the right things, where there's perhaps miscommunication or not valid communication around and effective communication around critical deal points, and especially when dealing with less sophisticated sellers, and trust me, physician practices, unless it's a group that's already in private equity coming out, tend not to be the most sophisticated sellers, and we understand that because the mission of the business historically has been clinical delivery. There's rarely a clear understanding of process going into a transaction. As it relates to valuation, surprises on valuation, can happen. I think, we just always want to make sure that, as we think about looking for successful outcomes and contrasting that to situations where perhaps, there have been challenges, always important to remember that various factors affect valuation, and those valuations need to survive validation via diligence, and many times diligence to a degree that's, beyond what our physician practice, even some of the more sophisticated groups might have experienced in the past or be expecting. Kate, you've talked about legal considerations, so if you want to flip slides, we'll keep moving through this. So if I go to the inverse and I think about what creates problems, let's spend just a minute here on how to prepare to be successful if we're the seller of a physician practice or a clinical enterprise. Again, buyers tend to be experienced in transactions, sellers not. That always produces an interesting, sometimes challenging dynamic. We think about before even starting to approach a process to sell a clinical enterprise, and I think this could apply really to all businesses, but maybe even more important in the clinical realm, ensuring that we put the right advisor group together, personal planning financial planning and tax planning that allows for establishment of valuation ranges, that could dictate Fed, ensuring that ownership of practices, which many times can be spread across large groups and numerous individuals with various decision rights, if that issue has been taken care of, and that evaluations of the alternatives have been evaluated. So ultimately, before process starts, one's thought about what are the attractive elements of transactions with private equity versus perhaps some type of a system employee model or transaction with the health system versus the pros and cons of aligning with the regional independent. And then also sellers that are successful, that have defined their objectives, tend to recognize that the marketing and practice is a sales process. There needs to be a story that is well told, that both looks back, and because acquirers of physician practices, not unlike the acquirers of any business, are paying very much for future patient revenue streams, that we're also being thoughtful about how we talk about the future. We've defined structured needs that we've intentionally filtered our suitors around those practical things we talk about, like ability to execute, perhaps size, but also things like culture and expectations of what physician providers are going to be required to do, and what the practice will look like post-transaction, et cetera. All while not compromising value, while continuing, which happens when we continue to execute the practice. And then prior to close, I couldn't understate the importance of this. Really having understood, and when I say deliver on diligence, really almost get them on a mock basis, having prepared diligence information, reviewed it, ensuring that there won't be any surprise on either buyer or seller end around diligence. If we flip to the next slide, we talk a bit about successful acquirers, which I think a successful acquirer is striving to be efficient. Again, if you're on the line and you're a buyer, you're likely a pro. These are simply reminders, and if I was to give you a headline, I think successful acquirers are working hard today to stay disciplined in a fairly undisciplined environment. That means trying to stay true to target profile, knowing strategy, staying within valuation ranges, and making sure. I always use the analogy of the bullseye with the colored circles and the black dot in the middle, making sure to stay in the colored circles when it's very easy to rationalize, stretching to get things done. Speaking clearly to the right decision makers within the target entity, ensuring the timelines and diligent lists, get out early, and that there's a great deal of clarity around what will be expected and what's going to be required to get to agreed upon outcomes, and then being prepared to and willing to action on walkaway points, and we all should have them, as we enter transactions. As we go into documentation, Kate, you were talking about the legal elements and some of the interesting dynamics of these types of transactions. I do see, in the physician practice realm, especially when the acquisition involves an independent or longtime independent practice, making sure that the buyer's educated as to what market terms are and what's reasonable. Doing all that we can to make a transaction easy for a seller. On the next slide, again, this all, I know that many of you may feel or seem like common sense, but it's important nonetheless, whether buyer or seller, to always recognize that the value in a transaction doesn't come from the documentation and a wire transfer. Nobody ever closes a bad deal, and when we see, we think about in context pitfalls to avoid. It's many times centers on integration and assimilation, making sure those factors relative to Fed are really well-defined early in process, and we live with them. So this list, that I've got on this slide could be twice as long for sure. And I'm not going to read through all of them, but making sure there's clarity on things like culture, and, goals and metrics and org design and process, and that, those things are discussed and they're evaluated, and common grounds are, discovered and arrived upon pre-close. Really important when it comes to creation and maintenance of value. And last slide, again, last but not least, as I think about those circumstances or scenarios where we're most likely to see smooth process, favorable outcomes. Again, common sense dictates the more complex the transaction dynamic, the more likely there may be challenges in execution. And so if I think about those circumstances where buyer and seller are strategically aligned, where there are commonalities in terms of culture and thought, where we've determined if we like each other as a buyer and seller before we start to negotiate. Valuations are reasonable, and the deal terms, when I say common, I really should, a better word than creative would be exotic, but reasonably standard deal terms without, overly exotic earn-out provisions and other dynamics that are hard to define. In those circumstances, we tend to see favorable outcomes. When either buyer or seller, and oftentimes it is the buyer, is perhaps trying really, really hard to get something done, are feeling a need or pressure to close transactions, so rationalized appetite. If I got a seller that's more short-term than long-term focused, looking for the size of a wire, by a given date on the calendar, where a seller is really stretched beyond a comfort level and valuation ranges that they may have established as reasonable previously, and we're getting overly creative in terms of how ultimately post-transaction a seller is going to get paid. That's when we see stress in process, sometimes failed process, and also challenge relationships post-close. As perhaps Kate was referring to in her prior example. So I always look at it, having been around the transaction business and transactions in various industries, I say maybe more so in the clinical healthcare realm than in other industries, really important to think about optimization versus maximization. So, how do we find those common grounds and those win-wins where everybody wins? When we start, looking to get very aggressive and maximize valuations, or ultimately, try to move more quickly than we should. That's when we run into problems and don't enjoy the long-term success. And as in any transaction. Again, success ultimately isn't defined by getting the deal done. It's defined, for a buyer, and what value is realized over time. And again, one of the very unique dynamics, I think, in many provider healthcare transactions is ultimately the seller stays with the transaction. He has to work, and ultimately is a primary source of driving that realized revenue over time. And so we do need to make sure that we're functional and we're efficient and we're working well together post transaction. Mm-hmm. With that, Kate, I think you flip it to your last slide. That's all.
Okay. Yeah, and I just want to underscore what you said. I think that it is so important to have great communication before a transaction, have the support from business consultants and a business team and attorneys, and communicate about lots of different issues, and make sure what's in the documents is practical and can actually be implemented, because we see it over and over again, where the selling physicians are surprised post-closing about changes that the buyer's making. And it's in everyone's best interest, including the buyer, to get everything out on the table beforehand. So I just wanted to say that I absolutely agree with your comments, Jerry. So
again, Kate, it could be a $10 million transaction or $100 million transaction, and just the same as it relates, to, as I say, and I really appreciate and I value provider mindset, and what's important to the provider.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Everyone, that was our, that was really the discussion portion that we had planned. Jerry and I are here to answer any questions you have. If you have any, if you don't, that's okay as well. Feel free to reach out to either of us afterwards. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to share?